Greetings, welcome back to Black Bear News, where we are discussing climate change, abrupt climate change, and things adjacent. And bringing you, well, I'm not going to start with this article. I'm going to start with this one. How they're going to make it harder and harder for people to resist industrial civilization and the infrastructure that supports it, right? You're going to have to go through the proper channels, and that's going to take 3 or 4 decades, all right? But it should be fine. We should make the 2050 zero carbon budget that Theresa May has proposed totally attainable. As new pipeline battle looms, Texas moves toward criminalizing pipeline protests. This is from Truth Out. For many environmentalists and landowners in Texas' iconic hill country, Kinder Morgan's 42-inch Permian Highway pipeline is aptly named. The company's planned 430-mile southeasterly route from West Texas to the Gulf would irrevocably scar this ecologically sensitive region, long defined by its porous hills of limestone that has until now managed to largely avoid oil and gas development in a state so defined by it. The $2 billion pipeline project is part of the industry's Trump-backed race to build oil and gas pipelines from the nation's most active oil patch in West Texas's Permian Basin to refineries near Houston and Corpus Christi, and eventually to the Gulf so that the Trump administration's molecules of freedom can be exported to the world. It's not the only way to export molecules of freedom. We got many, many styles that we like to deploy around the globe. But those who live along the proposed route, the fracked gas pipeline is yet another symbol of the fossil fuel industry's race to accelerate the climate emergency and the Earth's ongoing sixth mass extinction, a highway to the next Permian extinction event, literally fueled by the last one. Funny how things come full circle, isn't it? Several landowners along the route told me the same story when I visited them on their land. Kinder Morgan is bullying them into signing away their property at prices well below what it's worth, and the pipeline's impacts could be incalculable. They are incalculable. These landowners, alongside environmentalists and other concerned residents, recently packed a courtroom in downtown Austin this month as a judge heard arguments in a lawsuit filed by Hays County, the city of Kyle, and 3 landowners over the state's flimsy eminent domain process. That process allows oil and gas companies to condemn private property by merely checking a box claiming common carrier status on a one-page form. Of course, it's just that simple. Kinder Morgan and the state's oil and gas, what you want to do there's a box at the bottom of the form, and what you want to do is just put a check, and everything is fine. Kinder Morgan and the state's oil and gas regulatory body, the Texas Railroad Commission, are trying to dismiss the lawsuit, which asks for a temporary injunction to stop any condemnations in Texas's Gillespie, Blanco, and Hays counties until a trial can be held. Despite the fact that most of the 2 billion cubic feet of fracked gas that will move through the pipeline each day is intended for export, Kinder Morgan maintains that the pipeline is in the public interest because it will generate nearly $1 billion for state and county revenues annually. Leaseholders in the Permian Basin will earn far more than that, making more than $2 billion a year in royalties once production bottlenecks in West Texas are eased up. Boy, oh boy. All that money. But how are you going to eat if there's no food growing in the fields? Members of the Texas Real Estate Advocacy and Defense Coalition argue, however, that the pipeline's path threatens residential areas situated in what's being called the incineration zone, an area far exceeding the pipeline's easement that is at risk in the event of an explosion. Pipeline's opposition isn't just limiting those living directly in its path. Environmental activists and conservation groups are raising alarms about the pipeline's potential impacts on the land's sensitive karst topography, characterized by underground cavities, fractures, and drainage systems that feed area springs throughout the state's much-loved hill country. These springs, in turn, discharge into creeks, which then flow into Trinity and Edwards aquifers, the latter of which provides drinking water to 80% of San Antonio. Because the pipeline does not cross state lines, it is regulated only by the Texas Railroad Commission, which doesn't require an environmental assessment to evaluate environmental harm in the case of interstate pipeline. Wow, isn't that convenient? So let's move on down to what's happening legally. So felonies loom over future protests. This is the part that I really wanted to get to now, awaiting Governor Greg Abbott's signature. Those who damage so-called critical infrastructure facilities, including oil and gas pipelines under construction, would face a third-degree felony charge carrying a penalty of up to 10 years in prison. Protesters who simply impair or interrupt operations or who enter an easement with intent to damage a pipeline will face a state jail felony punishable by up to 2 years in prison. A Texas bill would similarly criminalize landowners if they interfere with operations even on their own property. Again and again, this legislature says that when it comes to oil and gas, we have a two-tiered system of justice, said Lucy Johnson, who served as mayor of Kyle from 2010 to 2014. There's landowner rights unless it's oil and gas, in which case oil and gas trumps everything, and now even in terms of law and trespassing. Wow. Okay. The Texas bill's passage has cast a shadow over the future pipeline fight in a state that has seen civil disobedience against other controversial pipelines, including the southern leg of the TransCanada's Keystone XL pipeline in East Texas and Energy Transfer Partners' Trans-Pecos pipeline in the far west Texas. Since President Trump was inaugurated, at least 17 states have introduced bills originally developed by the right-wing American Legislative Exchange Council that would further criminalize pipeline protests in some way. Now, the Trump administration is taking such model legislation to the federal level. It recently asked Congress to pass a bill that would send those who inhibit the operation of an oil or gas pipeline to prison for up to 20 years as part of a proposal to reauthorize pipeline safety programs at the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. Good Lord. So this goes on and on. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to link it below, but those are the pertinent facts that you need to know if you're trying to protest this pipeline in Texas. So they're already stacking the deck legally, right? As if the legal system was going to work for you in the first place if you were protesting this pipeline. Yeah, but so now it's you're not really even going to be able to protest it or go anywhere near it. So if you have plans to do so, I'd say be very, very careful. So lastly, I'm going to finish up this video with this. This is from Clean Technica. Best carbon capture facility in world emits 25 times more CO2 than Sequestered. Okay. Let's get into this a little bit. Clean Technica has been blip dip boop bapa doo. This is from June 12th by Michael Barnard. Clean Technica has been publishing a series of my analysis on carbon capture and sequestration technologies over the past year, as well as some additional pieces. 2 pieces on soil carbon capture and carbon farming have made the list, pointing out that these are beneficial but incredibly slow, and so while worth doing, do not mean we can keep emitting greenhouse gases. I also published on the scale problem of carbon capture in that to get a ton of CO2, you have to filter it out of a Houston Astrodome of air, and the Grand Canyon only contains about 1,270 tons of it. Then there are okay, I don't understand that. Then there are the 9 articles on the current darling of the carbon capture or direct air capture crowd, carbon engineering. The first 5 start here. The 3 specifically on air to fuel start here, and the last one on the expected use of pumping more oil, creating more greenhouse gases is here. The series show that there's no green in air carbon capture the way that carbon engineering is doing it, but that there are small niches where much wiser solutions like global thermostats make sense. That series showed in gory detail that mechanical air carbon capture is going to be a tiny wedge in the fight against fuel industry's PR flax. And the Global CCS Institute, a subset of the PR flax, are pumping into media sites. One of the articles looked at a 50-year history of mechanical carbon capture efforts, all entirely tied to the fossil fuel industry, most just used to pump more oil out of a played-out oil well. As enhanced oil recovery approaches, the assessment showed that virtually no CO2 by global standards has been captured by CCS, that a single year's output of current wind and solar farms are avoiding 35 times the CO2 that has been captured over 50 years of CCS history. Basically, all CCS is a rounding error on the actual solution, just stop emitting CO2. But one of the global examples stood out, the Norwegian Equinor in the North Sea. It is an amazing outlier in multiple ways. First off, it was put into operation in 1996, making it much older than most of the facilities. Second, it wasn't being used for enhanced oil recovery, but was actually sequestering CO2 as far as can be told. Third, it has been in continual operation for 23 years and sequestering about 1 million tons of CO2 a year, leading to it being the highest actual sequestration facility in the world. I guess there was one in the U.S., the Chute Creek facility. Oh, no. There is one, but it's being used to pump more oil. Finally, it was dirt cheap by CCS standards with a recorded capital cost of less than $30 million, compared to billions on some failed U.S. efforts. Sadly, things don't look as rosy under the covers as they do. This isn't the magic bullet on how to successfully, cheaply sequester CO2 that it looks like. Sleipner CO2 doesn't magically appear before sequestered. It's part of a natural gas that they pump out of the fields offshore from Norway into the North Sea. The gas contains 9% CO2. That is more than is allowed in the natural gas distribution network. They can't sell it as it is. Carbon dioxide is stripped from the natural gas with amine solvents and is deposited in a saline formation. The carbon dioxide is a waste product of the field's natural gas production. Storing it underground avoids the problem and saves State Oil or Stat Oil hundreds of millions of euros in carbon taxes. Sleipner stores about 1 million tons of CO2 a year. So has stored about 23 million tons, given the price point that looks close to $1 per ton, which is an astounding figure when Australia's history is about $4,300 per ton, and the USA's history is worse. Basically, they couldn't sell the natural gas without getting rid of the CO2, and they had to do something with it. Norway had a carbon tax even in 1996, so it made economic sense for State Oil to sequester it instead of just venting it into the atmosphere. They had to build most of the capability regardless, so I'm pretty sure the represented cost is just the extra cost of injection on top of what they had to do anyway. But this is the kicker. All the natural gas that they are shipping turns into a whole lot more CO2. The math is straightforward. For every 1,000 kilograms of natural gas, they grab 90 kilograms of CO2 and sequester it. Assuming zero leaks, the 910 kilograms of natural gas is burned by customers, producing a bit over 2,500 kilograms of CO2. Net CO2 emissions are approximately 2,410 kilograms for every 1,000 kilogram of natural gas they pumped out of the ground. What does that turn into in terms of real tons of CO2 sequestered versus emitted? Well, they are producing 36 million cubic meters of natural gas per day. They've been producing that daily since 1996, so that's about 300 billion cubic meters of gas. That turns into 581 million tons of CO2 emitted by the natural gas compared to the 23 million tons of CO2 that's been sequestered. Not a good offset. That's over 25 times more CO2 in the atmosphere than was sequestered. Equinor is being paid for the natural gas and the sequestered CO2. Nice work if you can get it. Not so nice for the planet. Anyways, interesting article. I had no idea that they were sequestering CO2 in this natural gas facility. I didn't read the whole article. I'm going to link it below, and you guys can tell me what you think about it in the comments section. Again, this highlights the difficulty in technology being the answer, right? Switching to zero carbon technologies actually requires CO2 in order to produce those things and to put them in place. And, sequestering carbon from the air requires energy to sequester the carbon from the air. So what, you're releasing carbon in trying to not release carbon in the future. And what the offsets just don't look good. And what was it? Oh, Lord Hugh said, rebuilding our entire infrastructure as a carbon neutral infrastructure, right? If we did all green technologies, we would end up releasing more CO2 in the air. There would be a CO2 gain in release in order to do that than if we just kept doing business as usual. So the answer is something else. The answer is to not release fossil fuels, to not use the technology, to learn to live without technologies, or stop doing the things that require the fossil fuel and require emissions. And so he also, in this article, he talked about carbon farming and soil sequestration, and there are other green ways of sequestering carbon. And I have an article I want to read on that. I'm going to read that in the next video. Kind of an interesting idea that's cropped up. And all of those technologies are pretty much the only thing we have to bank on, if we have anything to bank on at all. So there's got to be a lot more study and funding into those kinds of things. And yes, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for your eyes, your ears, and your conscience. If you would like to support this channel, you can do so at the links below. Until next time, peace.